goes a little something like.
Hello, Literates. I'm brittwriterly, and welcome back to Writer's Ambition. For those of you been hanging in since episode 1, use a real one. And for those of you who are just finding my humble channel, welcome. We hope you stay a while. So, for those of you who are just finding my channel, maybe you don't know or haven't seen my Within the Discourse series. I started it last year and did 2 videos sort of back to back, and I just sort of stopped because my channel's upload schedule changed from 4 videos a week to like 2 for the summer. And then I was like, this 2 a week thing, this 2 a month thing is good. This is it. With all the collaborations I was doing, it just sort of fell by the wayside. And it is actually a lot of work to do this series, because knowing something is one thing, but gathering that into essentially like a 20-minute lecture is another thing, because you got to have everything sort of laid out. So that was a lot of labor that I was just like, not right now. But this is very timely and super important. So, what the heck? Here I go. So we're going to talk about critical race theory, and specifically the way that critical race theory is being vilified in the media and why that might be happening. So we're just going to start with the definition of critical race theory. This is not some fancy academic journal that I'm reading from. It is edweek.org. Like, it's super simplified. It's not dense. So I'm just going to read this definition here, because it'll also take us into who created this term, which y'all know is of great concern to this series Within the Discourse. We want to cite the people who deserve to be cited, who did this intellectual work, whatever it is. And part of what's going on with critical race theory is that the term is being separated from the people that created it and the intent they had in creating it. So, what is critical race theory? Critical race theory is an academic concept that is more than 40 years old. The core idea is that race is a social construct, and that racism is not merely the product of individual bias or prejudice, but also something embedded in legal systems and policies. Pause. I should say, critical race theory is about 40-ish years old, right? But Black people in America thinking about race is centuries old. You can go back to Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Ann Jacobs. You can go back to Frederick Douglass's slave narrative. You can go back to the life and times of Oluda Equiano. Like, all of those slave narratives are talking about the experience of Black persons, African and African American persons in America. You can come forward to, let's jump a century. You can come forward to the Harlem Renaissance, right? The New Negro movement. Those are talking about the experiences of Black people in America. And you can get that from anthropologists, sociologists, poets, playwrights, right? Like anyone. Because Zora Neale Hurston, yes, we know her from Their Eyes Are Watching God, but she was also an anthropologist. So we can talk about Black people discussing their experiences of being Black in America since the beginning of Black people writing about their experiences in America, which we know has been going on for centuries. Let's come forward from 1920s, go up to 1950s and 60s, the Civil Rights Movement. What was that but Black people talking about their experience of being Black in America and what is untenable about that? We can go a little bit further up to the rise of Black nationalism, the Black Panther Party for self-defense, and to the 70s, 80s. We can continue, right, to have these conversations. We can have these conversations in any genre or discipline you want to. Black people have been talking about their experience of being Black in America on interpersonal and structural levels. Now, critical race theory was created by legal scholars, which we'll get to that in a second. But I just wanted to be clear, critical race theory often gets conflated with Black people talking about their experiences of being in America, but that's not what it is, right? Specifically, like it's very specific. So let's talk about that specific definition, just to say Black people have been talking about their experience being Black in America for centuries. Critical race theory is more recent and has a specific thrust, right? So the basic tenets of critical race theory, or CRT, emerged out of a framework for legal analysis. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, created by legal scholars Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Richard Delgado, among others. So specifically, critical race theory is for legal analysis. It is not meant to look at how your white boyfriend's parents treat you. It's not about that. It's not about interpersonal racism, right? If you want to talk about interpersonal racism, you might read Racism Without Racist by Eduardo Bonilla Silva. He talks about colorblind racism and the persistence of racial inequality in America. There is some structural stuff in here too, but there's also interpersonal stuff. So if you want to talk about that, here. It's not the same thing as critical race theory. Influenced by it, sure, but like as far as critical race theory is concerned with like purely systemic implications of race, purely systemic systems of racism, that's critical race theory. It's specific to that. Looking at race in other varieties of ways may intersect critical race theory, but critical race theory is specific, and so keep that in mind. Legal scholars created it, and again, that is Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Richard Delgado. You may recognize Kimberly Crenshaw's name as the legal scholar who coined the term intersectionality, right? So that is a definition of critical race theory. Just want to start with that because that's what we're talking about. So obviously we need to define it, especially because there are people who are intentionally lifting it out of that definition and intent for the purpose of vilifying it. And so the next thing I want to move to is this essay that was published by the African American Policy Forum by Anthony Conwright, who has been an educator for 14 years. He's also a freelance writer. So his essay is called White Anxiety Redefined: The Psychic Wages of Disfiguring the Meaning of Critical Race Theory. I'm going to read like 3 paragraphs over, but I'm going to pause in between the paragraphs just to sort of tease it out, because I don't want to assume that everyone that's going to see this video knows everything that he's saying and knows every person that he is talking about. So I'm just going to pause and annotate, but this is us getting the discourse built around it, right? We have the intellectual history and the definition of it. Now let's move into how we're seeing it in this particular situation. So Conwright begins: to loot an object of its meaning, the object must be seized and its identity erased through an abracadabra flourish of semantics so it can be made anew. Philosopher and psychiatrist Frantz Fanon, who is a huge historical figure in Black studies, philosopher and psychiatrist Frantz Fanon described this process in his 1952 seminal book, Black Skin, White Masks. Quote, "I am over-determined from without. I am the slave not of the idea that others have of me, but of my own appearance," Fanon wrote. End quote, begins another quote. "And already I am being dissected under white eyes, the only real eyes. I'm fixed. Having adjusted their microtomes, they objectively cut away slices of my reality. I am laid bare. I feel, I see in those white faces that it is not a new man who has come in, but a new kind of man, a new genus. Why? It is a Negro." So just want to say this. Using the word Negro now is basically a slur. It's definitely anachronistic, which means it's a word out of time. That is not a word that Black people used to describe themselves. It was a word that was assigned to them. It has a place in time, but it is not now. But I said it for the purpose of this quote. I do not want to see that word in my comments or I will block you. Okay. So that is the quote from Fanon, and Conwright opens with that, right, and sort of already sets out there already is a history of Black people thinking about the ways that they are determined by the white gaze. When Fanon says, "and already I am being dissected under white eyes, the only real eyes," he is not saying that he doesn't place any intrinsic value in the way that he sees himself. He is saying the way that he lives and moves in the world, the identity that is read by those around him is overdetermined by the white imaginary, is overdetermined by how he is called, right? That look a right. Okay, so that's how Conwright starts, by reminding us of this intellectual history of Black people, talking about and acknowledging that the way we are seen, read, misread, held in contrast to white people has long been a way of categorizing and understanding Black people. Right? Look, a blank. And Fanon says, it is not a new man who's coming, but a new kind of man. There is a Black man who stands in contrast to a white man. Look, a blank. That in is something that is outside of and is different from me. Right? So that's what Fanon is setting up, that Black people are used to define through a sort of counterbalance, through a sort of, let me not get too theoretical, that Black people are used as a sort of counterbalance to white identity. And I'll leave it at that without getting into like subjectivity and objectivity and da-da-da. Black people used as a sort of counterbalance for white people to understand themselves as, I am what this person is not. This person is these, and these negative things. In contrast, I am these, and these superior things, right? So this is sort of what Fanon is getting at. If you're interested in reading that book, once again, it is Black Skin, White Masks by France Fanon. Okay, so that's how Conwright opens. He moves on to say, the project of overdetermining Black people extends well beyond the corporal form and bleeds into academia. Remember that critical race theory is an academic term from legal scholars. Okay, under the lenses of white eyes, Black studies, hip-hop scholarship, and critical race theory are not what their pioneers defined them to be. These fields of study are seized, undressed, and converted into symbols that marshal anxiety among white Americans who no longer know who they are when Black people avow their autonomy. Pausing in the middle of that paragraph. Again, look, right? Someone outside of myself. Because I know that I am not that, I can define myself as this. This is something X, and X, criminal, monstrous, uncontrollable. I, on the other hand, am X, and X, positive thing, right? So you define yourself as not being what this other person is. When that other person is no longer how you define yourself, you lose your sense of self because you have so depended upon them to understand yourself. That's what Conwright is saying. Okay. Getting back into it, we've witnessed this process at a close remove, this process of, again, white Americans who no longer know who they are when Black people avow their own autonomy. So when Black people say, I refuse that. Look, I rebuke it. I don't allow you to define who I am. I define myself. And so Conwright is saying, when Black people take control of their own identity and who they are, white people, because they don't have that power of definition anymore, over another person, lose the ability to understand their own identity. That's what he's saying, okay? We've witnessed this process at close remove in recent months, as much the same rhetoric and legislation that transmogrified enslaved Africans into non-beings have been revived to spin the definition of critical race theory off into groundless abstraction and then denote its effective social meaning to be anything that triggers anxiety in white people. So in other words, critical race theory is anything that makes white people uncomfortable. Facts, history, social, legal analysis be forgotten. If what you're saying makes a white student uncomfortable, it is critical race theory and it is evil. I'm going to pause here before the last paragraph of his that I'll read so we can define. He talks about white anxiety here. We're going to talk about white fragility, which I've mentioned on this channel before, but it's been a while. And again, I don't want to assume. We've had a lot of literates join the squad since then. So also for y'all, we're going to back up and define white fragility. White fragility is a term that was coined by DiAngelo. And she wrote an essay of that title, White Fragility, in 2011, I believe. 2011. and it was published in the International Journal of Critical Pedagogy. And so I'm just going to read this one paragraph that DiAngelo defines white fragility, then we're going to weave that back into what that has to do with what's going on with critical race theory in K-12 education. Okay, DiAngelo writes, white people in North America live in a social environment that protects and insulates them from race-based stress. This insulated environment of racial protection builds white expectations for racial comfort while at the same time lowering the ability to tolerate racial stress, leading to what I refer to as white fragility. White fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. These moves include the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. These behaviors in turn function to reinstate white racial equilibrium. So what DiAngelo is saying is, when we create and another iteration of this article, she calls it like pillows, creating essentially like cushions between yourself as a white person and racial difference. So you live in a white neighborhood, you go to a white school, you graduate, go to a white college, if you go to college or vocational school or join the workforce, you work in a place where there is nary a person of color in sight, you will begin to believe yourself raceless. And maybe not consciously, but because of racial hegemony, I'm stressing the racial because there are other differences, right, that can cause tension and difference among white people, including but not limited to class, sexuality, and gender orientation, right? There are differences within that, but we're talking about critical race theory, so let's stay on that. When you grow up and live and persist in a white hegemonic space, when a black person comes in, when an Asian person comes in, when a Hispanic person comes in, when a Latinx person comes in, it looks like racial issues enter with them. It looks like race itself enters with them because they are hyper visible as racially different, which Fanon also talks about, right? That and being seen as a new kind of man entering, a new kind of man because of racial hegemony. You're coming in as that which is different, and so it looks like you are ushering in something, the something being race, rather than race being something that white people also have, like, I'm black, you're white, we both are raced. But because of white supremacy, it acts as if white people are raceless, and therefore the issues of race that we as a society wrestle against come in on the backs of people of color and have nothing to do with white people. And so that's a sort of social protection that DiAngelo marks, that creates circumstances and create environments of white fragility when you don't have practice dealing with race-based stress. And I want to read again the definition and then the reaction that white fragility causes, and then we'll see how that's working right now around us. White fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. These moves include the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. These behaviors in turn function to reinstate white racial equilibrium, what she calls earlier like white comfort, this comfort that you have. Because I've left the race situation because I am not race, because I am white, right? And so Conwright calls it white anxiety. It is really not really. We might otherwise understand it as white fragility that is causing this inability to stand critical race theory being taught in schools. The systemic nature of racism being taught in schools. Again, Eduardo Bonilla Silva talks about some interpersonal racism, but those things, that's one person. It is a much bigger and more inescapable problem when it is systemic. When you get books like The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander that talk about mass incarceration as an issue that is intersecting race heavily and historically. When you get books like The Hidden Cost of African of Being African American, How Wealth Perpetuates Inequality by Thomas M. Shapiro, and it talks about how wealth intersects race historically, right, and into the contemporary moment. Those things are harder to wiggle away from because it's not just one person being racist. It's not just one bad guy being rude to you. It is banks. It is redlining. It is schools being funded by property taxes, and knowing that if you were in a disenfranchised town, neighborhood where the property taxes are low, then your school's not going to be funded, right? It's understanding that there are many different intersections of race and how people live in the world, systemic, right? It's not individual. That is what critical race theory is talking about. Understanding that is way more uncomfortable than you having one friend who looks at you weird or who doesn't like your food or whatever. Like that's you can walk away from that. You can't walk away from the fact that race impacts nearly, if not every, impacts and a very, very purposefully so, impacts most of the ways in which, if not all the ways in which we move around in the world. We'll stay in America for the sake of just being specific. And that doesn't mean that things like class and gender and ability don't come in. They do. Those things intersect race and everything else. But again, we're talking about race specifically. Okay, and so the last paragraph of Conwright that I'll read is, if this sounds hyperbolic, just consider the testimony of the lead propagandist in today's CRT, critical race theory, moral panic. Quote, strung together, the phrase critical race theory connotes hostile, academic, divisive, race-obsessed, poisonous, elitist, anti-American, said Manhattan Institute fellow Christopher Rufo. Quote, critical race theory is the perfect villain. True to his word, Rufo has been aggressively promoting a wholly imaginary version of critical race theory while projecting just about every conceivable brand of white anxiety onto it in exactly the fashion that Fanon long ago diagrammed, right? So we have Fanon's diagram of overdetermining me, of understanding yourself. Contrasted to me, we also can add DiAngelo to that, of Christopher Rufo's reaction, right, of such a aggressive misrepresentation of critical race theory that utterly divides it, that utterly dissects it, that utterly ignores its intellectual history and the purpose of creating this sort of concept for the purpose of law, for the purpose of saying these things are wrong, these things are racist, because race, while a social construct, also have social consequences that are not as simple as me to you, that are indeed as complex as education, wealth, home ownership, right? Like all of these different things. And so when we talk about critical race theory in K-12 education, it absolutely is a matter of understanding the discourse of the concept, of understanding the history of how it has been used to point out the effect of racism on a structural level. If we can't point it out, then of course we can do nothing to fight it in a court of law. Sounds like the point. If you can't prove that wealth intersects race at all, then how could we have ever talked about redlining? If you can't prove that stop and frisk has anything to do with race and where is this practice being held out, then of course you can do nothing to fight against that practice. Of course you can do nothing to critique the prison industrial complex and the overrepresentation of Black people, men and women, in the prison industrial complex, right? So critical race theory absolutely poses a threat to white supremacy, and this most recent attack on critical race theory being taught in schools is absolutely a part of this long-standing attack on any sort of race critique that has been organized and oriented and in any way successfully or effectively deployed, right? So that might have been super dense. Feel free to go back and watch again and all that kind of stuff. Feel free to read these books that I held up. Feel free to read Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. It is a book, but it is also an essay, and I have heard people express that the essay is better than the book. So do with that what you will, read what you have access to, but if you have access to the essay, it's 17 pages. Obviously, it's shorter than a whole book, and it does the job. It's very specific to White Fragility. The book actually goes into like a lot more apparently, so whatever. But anyway, thank y'all for watching. No comment prompt, just, you know, if there are any of these books that you want to read, definitely shout that out. If there was something that you found super striking about what you may have discovered in this video, sure, shout that out. I want to let you know that if you ask a question that's going to require a lot of me to respond to, I'm just gonna like hit the little like heart emoji, and I probably won't answer it because that's a lot of labor. This channel isn't monetized, so nothing that I do pays me. And so if it requires a lot of labor, it's for me to answer that question, I'm not going to answer it, but I will acknowledge it. So just be aware of that. All right, y'all have an amazing day. I hope something was said in this video that really makes you think and interrogate and go further into this discourse to understand not only its history, but its present day implications, right? So y'all have an amazing day. Again, bye-bye. Oh, make sure you like this video. Make sure you like this video. And if you have not hit that notification bell, you definitely need to ring it. I'm not gonna do the whole song. Definitely need to ring the bell. And I will see y'all next time, okay? Bye bye.